Welcome to this invitation, this urging for you to think the unthinkable right at the start of the annual meeting and the business forum. As we told the EBRD when they invited us to do this session and convene it later in the week, will be really far too late in a 5-day process. You need to be thinking the unthinkable right from the beginning. Well, you may have heard John Kerry, the US presidential envoy for climate change, and Frans Timmermans, the EU vice president, talking about an hour ago about the real challenges that they're facing. Let me just underscore that because it is an important backdrop for what we're going to hear from our three guests. Huge frustration, nothing like the pace and scale needed to address the climate emergency, to counter the enormity of the existential threat that we're all facing, the realities. And as John Kerry said, no government in the world has enough money to do what we need to do. Much business as usual is going on, but actually the current models don't work. We've got to change so much. The target should not be net zero by 2050, but net zero by 2030 or well before that. The world needs a wartime mentality, as John Kerry said. And what we're talking about, there are significant moves on finance at the moment, but the scale and needs are enormous. We need every new idea that we can find. And that's what this session is about, coming up with new ideas. So for every one of you, whether in government, whether in companies, whether in organizations you work at, these are unthinkable times, or rather, are they unpalatable? In other words, there's an inevitability about what's happening. How radically, how bravely are you thinking for handling the next unthinkables? We would like to know. This is not a panel for you to listen to passively. It's your opportunity. And I really do mean an opportunity. We need to hear actively from you in the next 75 minutes. The bank told us that they want untypically what they called an edgy session. So please feel free to break out of your comfort zones. That's what we need to hear in these unthinkable times. That's what today's world requires at the moment. We'll give you the address you can send your thoughts to in a moment, but just let me tell you that I'm Nick Gowing, founder and co-director of the Thinking the Unthinkable project, which I created in 2014 when I could see that so much stability we took for granted was already unraveling. Then Chris joined me to find out from leaders why they were struggling. Many were alarmingly frank. Look where we are now. Chris.
Thank you, Nick. And we captured what the leaders were saying to us about their concerns about radical uncertainty in our book, Thinking the Unthinkable. And we can certainly say with COVID-19, there's been 15 years change in 15 months. And as we all know, it's not over by any means. And the pandemic is a stark warning to the sort of changes that we'll need to make to address the challenges of climate, nature, and inequality, to name but three. Few of us expected the pandemic. And although our work signaled the inevitability of such unthinkable shocks and the impact on leadership, people didn't really listen. Radical change now requires a radically different way of thinking. And that's what the bank wants us to do now in the next hour. So that's why we invite you to engage right away. Nick will give you the details in a moment.
We're delighted to be joined by three leading global figures to address this, to address unthinkables and unpalatables. In response to whatever you raise. So please get on the front foot now and start raising those issues. First of all, we're joined by Mark Carney, the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance, and the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson's financial advisor for COP26, former head of the Banks of England and Canada. He's with us for the first 45 minutes. Mark, welcome.
Thank you, Nick. It's a pleasure to be here.
From Istanbul, we're really delighted to welcome Ebru Dildar, Edin, the Executive Vice President from one of Turkey's leading banks, Garanti BBVA. Warm welcome to you, Ebru.
Hello, great to be together with you today.
And we are delighted you're here because you are leading the bank's pioneering work on dramatic shifts on client attitudes on sustainability. So you really know what it's like in your market. So it's great you're here. And joining us here in the EBRD studio, but obviously safely socially distanced, we're delighted to welcome Baroness Minouche Shafik. She's director of the London School of Economics, and she's worked in the highest levels of government and finance. And one of the many reasons she's with us today is because of her book, and I'll show up a second book, which is the book that she has written here on what we owe each other. She argues that the social contract is broken, and there is an imperative for a new contract if we're to overcome the unthinkables. And we think that the thinking in the book very much aligns with the thinking in Mark Carney in your book on values. So we'll be focusing the second part of our conversation on the issue of inequality in the social contract. But first of all, let's hand over to Nick. And I'm going to be monitoring all the questions. So please keep putting them in. We're going to give you now the details of how you can pose your questions. Over to you, Nick.
And we want to hear from you. Let me just give you the address, therefore. It is think-am2021 at ebrd.com. There you can see it in the bottom left-hand side of the screen. Let me repeat that. Think-am2021 at ebrd.com. Please get your thoughts coming to us now. Don't leave it right to the end. And there is a Q&A function. If you're a registered attendee, you can also submit that way as well. And if you're watching LinkedIn Live, then send us an email address. Mark, it's good to see you. We haven't been able to talk because you're having connectivity problems getting onto us, which is why we're a moment or two late. But Mark, let me just ask you whether you're agreeing with the kind of things we've heard from John Kerry and Frans Timmermans of the EU, that really the enormity still has not been understood of the challenges we face for the climate emergency.
It's good to be here, Nick. I'm not sure exactly the comments to which you're referring to, but I'm not sure we need to quote any specific luminaries to underscore the scale of the climate emergency, the challenge of 50% emissions reduction globally over the course of this decade. It's something that affects every region, every company, every sector. So yes, without question, the scale is large, the time is short, and the need for action is considerable.
John Kerry described it as like wartime now, and people don't really address it, don't understand it. Are you facing a real challenge now on getting the public to understand the enormity of what really is needed, quite apart from what you're doing in the financial area?
Well, I think you focus on what you can impact, and my focus is the financial area. It is enormous. I'm not sure a public advocacy campaign is my strength. After all, I was a central banker. That limits my ability to connect. But to connect with the financial sector and get the financial sector aligned with the scale of the task, and not something in the periphery of the financial sector, not niche markets, but absolutely mainstreaming in financial sector. And I would say that we are making progress there. I'll just reference the number 70 trillion, which is the core of the system that has committed not to net zero just in 2050, but 5-year decarbonization plans, annual accounting towards that, sectoral decarbonization plans. And that's in the course of the last 2 months, and very much helped by Secretary Kerry's efforts and President Biden's leadership.
What is the main message you'd like to put to these delegates to the annual meeting of the EBRD? Because in the end, they are facing significant challenges in so many areas and sectors that they're working in.
Well, I think there's two things. One is, in order to address the climate emergency, we need to have climate change part of every financial decision. It needs to be a fundamental consideration, just like credit risk is always a consideration in a financial decision. So it needs to be integral to everything we do. That's the first. The second is that, and this is not a truism. This is actual. This is an enormous economic opportunity alongside. We're a world that's had too little investment. It has been too concentrated when it's happened. It's benefited too few. And as this is an issue that touches everyone, every region, every company, it is an opportunity to spread. It is a necessity, but an opportunity to spread growth and jobs across the region. So we should be thinking of it in those terms. Last point, if I may, Nick, we just went through shutting down large swaths of our economy. We barely made the 7% reduction in emissions that we need to see year in, year out. What does that underscore? We can't shrink our way to addressing the climate emergency. We need to invest and grow in order to get there.
Thanks, Mark. Let's go immediately. We've got a question from the President of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, Odile Renaud-Bassot, who joins us from her office in this building. Odile.
Thank you, Nick, and very nice to have you all discussing this, the unthinkable. And one question I had for Mark, which I'm very pleased to see here, is, thinking out of the box. I mean, now we've been discussing a lot COVID, and the second crisis that is looming very clearly is climate crisis. but thinking out of the box and getting out of sort of incremental action we are all focusing on, what would be your suggestion? I mean, something that would make us make a big leap forward in climate action.
Well, I don't and it's good to see you, Adil, as well, and I'm glad that you're in that role. But I wouldn't underestimate the fact that we have the core of the financial system now committing to net zero. That's the first thing. The second thing, I would say, from a multilateral institution perspective, and the EBRD in many respects has led this, you should be thinking each time, the orders of magnitude are measured in trillions. The unit of account for incremental programs is at least 50 billion per annum. They need to scale to that order of magnitude, if not 100 billion. That's the unit of account. So the question is, with using balance sheet, with using initiatives, what's the scale of private sector capital that is going to be multiplied and crowded in? That would be, I don't know if that is out of the box, but that's very much aligned with the scale of what's needed. And I think what you have done, the EBRD has done with A tranche, B tranche loans, there's many other examples, is starting to show the pathway for what we need to do collectively with the multilateral and the development finance architecture, if I can put it that way. That is where we need to focus and get this into scaling towards trillions of dollars. We have the early stage on the private side, but we need to leverage it much more rapidly.
Mark, Odile, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
You know, I was wondering beyond, I mean, because there is a financial side, but I was wondering also whether, you know, on the technical and on the industrial challenge, for example, should we set objective like having all transportation by electric means in 10 years?
Yeah.
You know, so I bring all
Yeah, sorry, I know time's short and we have to think out of the box, but absolutely. And one of the things, and exactly what you just said, Odile, is a example of what we need to do. So if we have the orientation, which we're starting to have, of thinking towards net zero, financial sector that's taking climate change into account, and then if we have credible and predictable public policy, not in the distant future, but far enough off that we can make the investments, companies can make the investments to deliver, that will crowd in investment today and adjustment today. So exactly what you just said, zero emission vehicles in Germany, in the UK, other jurisdictions by 2030, no new internal combustion engines vehicles, that drives investment today and innovation today. Hydrogen fuel blends at a point certain in the future, carbon prices at levels in the future, again, not conceptual but actual, legislated ideally. That's exactly the type of approach. And you know, Janet Yellen and I worked on a huge, well, very large analysis around exactly this point, the interaction between the financial sector and credible policy. And so I very much agree with what you just put forth. And the last thing, if I can say, is that, of course, and you know, Nick, there was a challenge earlier in terms of communicating with the public. Well, one of the ways to communicate with the public are these objectives that are very tangible: zero emission vehicles, zero emission grid, zero emission fulfillment on e-commerce. So the cost of actually delivering by dates certain and working towards those in a way that, you know, we have supported public policy, but we're really driving measurable outcomes through the private sector and in the consequence, as a consequence, creating growth and jobs.
You both mentioned the box. There's an argument which says there is no box anymore. Let me, Mark, move on with a question from Chidi Obihara, and that shows that please get your questions in as quickly as possible. Are you calling for an end to all new fossil fuel financing by the year end of 2021? Is that realistic? Should COP26 debate it? And should we add as well what the IEA reported 6 weeks ago, making it clear there should be no investment of any kind like this?
Well, I think what we need is transition finance in energy that's transitioning to the new energy, and all of it has to be put in that context. We're calling for an end of coal financing, advanced coal and coal operations, more than financing, coal operations in advanced economies, all ending by the end of this decade, and in emerging and developing economies by the end of the next. Fossil fuel, there is I think the tag end of that question was not realistic. There's a difference between financing new and financing ongoing operations as there's a transition out of fossil fuels towards renewable energy. I think we have to recognize that the scale of what's required, also in the IEA report, is on a daily basis by the end of this decade, building the largest solar plant, solar field every day, for years over the course. So the scale of what's needed to scale up is considerable, which is why it's called a transition.
John Kerry made clear that even one of those each day would still not be enough. Such is the scale. Mark, could I ask you to pause one moment? Let's go to Istanbul, where we're joined. I hope you were able to hear the introductions by the Executive Vice President for Corporate Investment Banking and Global Markets at Garanti Bank, because Ebru, welcome to this question session. One of the things you've said to us very clearly is the struggle, and I'm using your words from your bank, that you are having to mount in order to convince people, particularly in the difficult to abate sectors, to think in very different ways, to change their mindset. What kind of struggle are you facing based in Istanbul? Could you unmute?
Do you hear me?
You now.
Okay. Yeah. As a developing country, yes, we do have the priorities is sometimes changing a little bit. That's why, as a bank who is very active in project finance for the last more than 20 years, we had a lot of difficulties. At least in the beginning, it was very difficult for us to convince the clients that it is for the sake. It's not just a request coming from the bank. It's also for their sake, also for their future. And also at that time, I'm talking mainly 5-6 years ago, not many in Turkish banks had these kind of requests as we did. And of course, now the priorities are changing, and now we have started the other banks also coming part of that conversation, and they are also having their request as well. Now things are getting easier in some part. But on the other part, as I said before, this year we have announced that we are going to, by 2040, we won't be having any coal exposure in our balance sheet. It is something that we were the first bank in Turkey to announce that. We had a kind of a reaction from our customers, because they say that in a country like Turkey, industrial productions, it is important for us to be able to have a low cost of energy and to continue and to have the contribution for the economy. It is important, but we are trying to say that green recovery is important, and we will be willing to finance their conversion from the coal or fuel fossils to green, and also the innovative products investments as well. And it takes some time, but I think in the long term we are becoming more successful on doing it. But of course, it has to be spreading out to all sectors.
Because what you're experiencing is being mirrored in many other countries, both developed and developing. I remember hearing the chief executive of the Citibank, Jane Fraser, say it's really, really hard to change mindset. She said that at the Biden summit at the end of April. And I'm putting that to you because what is the argument you use which convinces people to change in the ways that Mark says they've got to move?
We are saying that, they should not be looking today. They need to look at out of the box, because if they continue doing the same business as they are doing today, in 5 years, 10 years, they won't be able to have these kind of productions. And, for 10 years ago, we were saying to other sectors that, and they have seen that we were right on that. And they have to look at it as we are so much global now as we were before. And anything that we are doing here in Turkey is also having an impact on other parts of the world. And for them, in order to be sustainable, to be able to continue doing their businesses, they should be taking action now, because the world, the investors, if you look at from their point of view, today the companies that they are investing, they won't be investing in 5 years. And in order for them to attract the other attention of the other investors, they have to take action today.
A question here, Mark, from Guy Taylor. New sources of finance are clearly needed. So what do the panelists think about creating a moratorium on money of the dirty kind being allowed to be part of the mainstream economic system?
Yeah, I'm fine with that. I've spent a lot of time trying to enforce those moratoriums, including with Odile and others on the paradis fiscaux. So yes, I support that.
Is it achievable?
Well, look, I mean, is the elimination of crime achievable, Nick? I mean, we're always fighting against these things, and we can get better, and authorities should get better. I'm focused on channeling private finance to address the climate emergency. Is where I'm focused now. Those are my responsibilities.
What would be your assessment? How would you categorize it, Mark, about the speed at which adaptation and change is taking place? I would suggest to you, actually, it's probably moving even faster than you imagined was possible.
In terms of the mainstreaming of net zero, focus on that, climate finance, it is absolutely moving faster than I thought possible. And I would have thought possible. I'm very pleased to be wrong about this. I think we need to really convert this momentum into not just the orientation of financial institutions, but the actual financing of projects on the ground that benefit, and also, very importantly and consistent with these annual meetings, to ensure that finance, which is now considerable, isn't just landing in the G7, the advanced economies. I mean, there are huge financing needs here, but we need it spread rapidly across the membership of the EBRD and then more broadly around the world. So I think, Nick, that's the. It's not a pivot, but that's the broadening that is necessary. Going to projects, but going to projects around the world, and then assessing the impact of those and adjusting.
Another question, then I'm going to go to Minouche Shafik. Thinking outside the box, do we need to start going beyond TCFD disclosures? And if so, what should MDBs do to push clients to raise the level of ambition? I have to say that both John Kerry and Frans Timmermans were raising this as an option earlier.
Well, the first thing is absolutely. I mean, TCFD is the opening ante. It's what's required, that type of disclosure, in order to begin to move ahead. But we need to go further. We need to go further into disclosure of nature and biodiversity. That's clear. But then again, to get to the heart of the climate issue, what we need is we need net zero plans. We need short-term measurable milestones for those plans for companies, plans for financial institutions. We need to track those. Within the financial sector, we need climate stress tests and supervisory approaches. And then I think we need a common language to assess where financial portfolios are, which is why we're working on implied temperature rise and degree warming techniques, so that you can look at a bank or a pension fund, and one may have a 3-degree portfolio, one may have a 2.5, one may have a 2-degree portfolio, and it moves into the language of what our objectives are. Now, to be clear, Nick, there's been a huge move in terms of intent, but it's starting very late. So the reality of these portfolios, and I'll finish with this, if you look at most equity markets, most major government bond markets, corporate bond markets, those portfolios are consistent with a world that's going to warm above 3 degrees. But that's the information we need out there, and then we need to see the management of those down.
Chris.
We have a couple of very interesting questions on the linked issue of the nature crisis, biodiversity, and I'm just going to select one of them. Reflecting on the climate emergency, and also in parallel discussions on the future of work, what would we be better off identifying? What are the key impacts on our lives of the environmental and structural reasons for inequality in re-examining the linkages? Can we be radical about and think about redesigning our lives rather than the future of work, focusing on the wider questions of the environment and the climate, in addition to addressing the social issues? How do we address the 3 issues of nature, climate, and economic issues in a synchronous way? I think essentially is the drift of the question.
Well, it's a remarkable question. I wouldn't pretend I have a 2-sentence answer to that. I'd underscore a couple of things. One is that the type of lower carbon infrastructure, whether it is in transportation, whether it's in any form of final direct demand, that is investment heavy. It tends to be job heavy. The question is how geographically dispersed that is going to be. The second thing is, I do think that maybe I'll finish with this, one of the issues in terms of the changing nature of work and commerce is I think we all know this, it's becoming more platform-based. That creates an opportunity for it to be more disaggregated, smaller holders, smaller businesses, entrepreneurs that are connected to that platform. That's great. That potentially has benefits that are both consistent with spreading of opportunity and lower footprints if we are deliberate about that. It's one of the reasons earlier, well, it doesn't matter where it was, but earlier today, discussing these opportunities with the central bankers in terms of the nature of payments and the way we can use a new payment system to help drive this type of entrepreneurship. I haven't answered the nature question, and I want to finish with acknowledging a couple of things. One is that there is a relationship, obviously, between climate and nature, but climate does not guarantee nature, biodiversity, and those outcomes. I mean, the people joining this would recognize that. And then the other point I wanted to make is we have to be careful in terms of trying to count nature in monetary terms. That's my view, at least, on it. We need to count nature on its own terms, in terms of species, in terms of population, in terms of pollution outcomes, and drive towards those types of improve those metrics, as opposed to bring it in too closely into the monetary system, which, in my view, at least, will bring us towards a sort of market trade-off type approach, which ultimately would be detrimental.
Let me pick up with Minouche Shafik. Minouche, you've been very patient here for the moment, and we're going to be talking with you at greater length after Mark has to leave. But picking up on that one particular point about the redesigning of life and what you're talking about the need for a new social contract. In other words, the way we are functioning at the moment, or have been functioning up to COVID-19, is simply no longer going to be appropriate because of the expectations, one part of which is biodiversity and the natural life.
Well, I think the issue of what's happened with the planet can be really framed as a failure of the intergenerational social contract. And we have stolen from future generations for our own purposes. And the question of how to rebalance that, I think, is key. If you do try and quantify the legacy we're leaving future generations, we're actually leaving them quite a lot of physical capital, and Partha Gupta has kind of estimated this, that we've left them vast quantities of infrastructure, machinery, etc. We've left them a good increase in human capital, but we have massively depleted the natural capital that we are leaving them behind. And you could argue, and he actually does attempt to quantify this in monetary terms, that we have depleted our natural assets in a suboptimal way, even from the narrow perspective of the optimal level of investment in the assets that we have in our societies, natural, human, and physical.
Well, let's pick that up if we can, because I think what you've done is given us a taster of what you've been saying and what you're pushing very hard on the social contract. But Mark, while you're with us, can I pick up a question here from Edward Mullock? Incentivizing and aligning the financial sector is clearly starting to work, but how do you start to incentivize and align public policy in countries that could be seen to be, and his words here, a dictatorship?
Well, we have a shared responsibility. I mean, obviously, we have shared responsibility for the climate crisis, the crisis in nature. We have these processes that are trying to raise ambition and race to the top. We are having some momentum, and that's probably a bit of an understatement for COP. When the UK took over the presidency in partnership with Italy, 30% of the Earth's emissions were covered by net zero commitments. It's now 73%. And not all of those who have those commitments are liberal democracies. So we have to work by focusing and, as I say, raising ambition, through examples. One of the key issues, and I'll stop here, Nick, is that we really do, and again, it's the spirit of these meetings and what the EBRD does, but we need to have the capital and the facilities and catalyze as much as possible private sector investment that's going to all parts of EBRD's membership, but all parts of the world, in order to align incentives. In the end, we need finance, we need politics, however those politics are determined in different countries, and we need engineering solution, and they are clearly mutually reinforcing, and we're getting finance there. We've had progress on engineering, and we need the politics to lead.
Let me ask this question to Ebru from Max Sakyan, because I think also, Mark, that there's obviously a global implication for you. But Ebru, is there a real danger if countries do not accept globalization and togetherness with climate change? Does that worry you? We've seen in the past, only till something truly happens right in front of people's eyes, countries act together, as with COVID. And the ozone hole is a good example of this. However, it might be too late in regards to climate change. Look what's happening with the incredibly high temperatures in the northwest of the United States and Canada at the moment, as you'll know, Mark. Look what's happening in Siberia. Suddenly, people are beginning to realize that something dreadful potentially is happening. What's your view about the way mindsets can be changed here, Ebru?
If we were talking 3-4 years ago, I would be just getting a little bit scared of the awareness of the governments will be there when it is needed. But this year with COVID, we have seen that, even in a year like this, that everybody was locked down for at least 3 to 4 months, the carbon emissions has declined only 7.6%. And please do remind that every year we need to have 7% decrease so that we will be able to meet the 1.5% increase in the temperature. This is a really big problem, and I'm very happy to be able to see that the governments in US, in EU, even in China are giving so hard commitments to be able to stick that target. And I'm also becoming more positive about Turkey. In Turkey, this year we have seen, starting from last year after September, the government has taken many actions regarding the EU. Also EU's taxonomy and the other stuff will be having a big impact to Turkey, because almost 50% of our imports is to EU, and the green recovery and the tax on border will be having a big impact. Let's say if it is a $50 per ton, it will be having 1.8 billion euros of impact to Turkey economy if the carbon price is 50. If it is 150, just we need to triple it. And because the impact will be not only climate-wise, it will be also economically, I think the governments are taking the problem very seriously, and it has become the global coordination as well. And the actions, for example, very recently, the Banking Association in Turkey as well as the BRSA is saying that taxonomy, they are having a study about the implement taxonomy in Turkey as well. These are really good news. And I'm also, there is one thing that everybody has, the awareness in Turkey is increasing. I'm sure that you have seen in the press, in Bosphorus and in Marmara Sea, we have seen a big bacteria in the sea. They are calling in Turkish mucilage. I don't know exact English word for that. But it is, the main reason is dirtiness coming from the industry, global warming, so that it's having a strong impact on our daily life. That's why the governments won't have any choice to take actions immediately. That's why I'm so much positive about it.
Thank you, Ebru. Mark, I know you've only got about 5 minutes left with us. Let me just ask you to address this, because this is a question from Ali Saeed. about how you encourage late movers, as he puts it, to come along. We need better clarity on which countries, organizations, financiers promote and support sustainable projects with a central database. Now, in other words, underscoring something you've talked about so often, and many in your area talked about, the need for much better data and coordination and collaboration.
Yes, well, Ali's, the question is bang on, and I'm glad it's raised. We do need this consistent information, and what we have. So there's a couple of things people can look for in terms of to separate the gold standard from the rest. And the first is a financial institution a member of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero? There is a difference. There's a difference in terms of the short-term obligations that exist under what's called GFANZ. It's annual reporting, 5-year decarbonization milestones, specific annual plans, sector plans in order to achieve those. So that's the first thing. And then, of course, what comes with that is the annual reporting of carbon footprint today. And the better institutions, or I think this will become the market norm, but will also be able to project out where they think those emissions are going to be tomorrow, and then we'll be able to match them against. Now, if you're not in one of the constituent parts of that, the Net Zero Banking Alliance is one example, or the Asset Managers Alliance, then you're not in the gold standard. You may have some programs on sustainability, you may have some other worthy initiatives, but it's not a comprehensive approach that's being taken. So the first is a very binary assessment. Then, what we want to be is in a position where everybody's reporting against these and the judgments are made more comprehensively. I do think that in some areas, asset management, probably in pension funds and others, we will get to a position relatively soon where, as I say, the degree warming potential of a portfolio will be judged. So in other words, how far are the companies I'm investing in or lending to, or both, how far are they from being Paris aligned? And to be clear, Paris aligned doesn't necessarily mean net zero today, but it does mean having an investment plan and making those investments, not just a plan, but making those investments so that the pathway of emissions is going down consistent with best practice in your industry. And that's where we need to get to. So we need those summary metrics so people can make judgments. Are you in the right alliance? Where's your degree warming going? But then also, of course, Nick and Ali, we need much more detail so that those summary metrics can be judged.
Final question before I think you have to slip away, and then we will talk to Minouche. What is the game? This comes from one of the managing directors here, Jonathan Charles. What is the game changer, the game changer, the unthinkable that nobody really is prepared to think about now? What's on your mind which you feel you should be talking about a bit more?
Well, look, the game changer on climate. There is no game changer on climate. That's the bottom line. This is something, and I'm not trying to dodge the question. This takes all financial institutions. It takes a huge range of technologies. It takes all companies. It takes all hands, and it takes a continued focus. A simple answer, of course, would be to say, well, what we should have is a carbon tax and tax it at its source, and then it flows through the global economy. I mean, I can give you that, but I don't think I would be misleading if my views if I suggested that there was one solution that would fundamentally change the game.
All right. Well, Mark, I think you have to slip away. Thank you very much indeed. We know you're a little late, but we hope you've managed to
try and log into my next Zoom, so I've got to start early. Sorry about that.
We've got a pile of Zooms. Thank you very much indeed, and thanks for making it at least, even if we had to delay the start. Much appreciated, and good luck.
Thanks.
Let's pick up with Minouche and also Ebru. Now, Minouche, let's move to you because of not just your book, but also your radical thinking about the need to change a social contract. But the social contract simply is not working at the moment. I don't have to quote much of what is in your book, but you make clear that this is really potentially quite a significant negative. What I'd like to do is invite the attendees of the forum to now shift your questioning towards Minouche and Ebru so that we can, because sadly Mark is gone, and I'd like you to underscore just how serious, but how urgent this issue of the social contract is.
Well, I think the social contract was broken even before the pandemic, and it was evidenced by the fact that 4 out of 5 people in the world, in countries as different as the US, China, India, Brazil, and most of Europe, feel the system isn't working for them. And of course, the pandemic only exacerbated the divisions in our society and people's frustrations with inequality, insecurity. And of course, you could see who suffered most during the pandemic. It was people who were in precarious work, who couldn't even afford to take off sick if they were ill. It was women who suddenly had to carry the brunt of the costs, of social costs of COVID. It was the young who were deprived of education and employment. It was the old who were the most vulnerable from a health perspective. And so all of those groups that suffered during the pandemic, I think, reflect the fact that the social contract for looking after each other has been broken.
So what's the message for all those watching today from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development? This is about reconstructing society, developing society.
Yes, it is. And I think what I try and do in the book is show how the social contract can change in each aspect of life. The way we educate our children, the way we raise our children, how we define work, how our educational system works in terms of the economy, and how we deal with the elderly. And in each of those areas, I think one can define a difference. Let me just give one example. In the domain of work, and someone asked a question already about the future of work. We know that work is becoming more flexible, but with that flexibility comes much greater insecurity. People no longer, the old social contract assumed that you'd work for maybe 3 or 4 employers over the course of a lifetime. Today, people often work for 3 or 4 employers in the course of a week. And that is good for efficiency and has been very good for companies and consumers. It hasn't been so great for workers and the insecurity that they carry. And so there is now a need for a social contract that, for example, provides benefits to flexible workers and provides them with some degree of security. But I actually think flexibility is a good thing. So we don't want to lose flexibility, but we also need to think about, in addition to that security from benefits, how do we help workers continue to develop their skills to remain relevant to the marketplace? And so a new social contract needs to think much more creatively about who pays for reskilling. Maybe employers aren't the right ones anymore because they don't have as much of an incentive. And maybe society as a whole needs to help workers stay relevant.
Because, and Chris is going to pick up here as well, our social contract has failed to manage the adverse consequences of huge material progress. That is a big challenge for everyone involved with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, because even if there is good change and there are positives, it's leaving people behind, who feel dispossessed, who feel disappointed, and that the system of development is not delivering what they expected.
It's very true. And it's interesting. One of the interesting bits of research that I cite in the book is that, politicians often think that people vote their pocketbook. And if GDP goes up during my tenure, I will get reelected. What actually the evidence shows is that people vote their well-being. If my health, physical and mental, improves during your tenure, if I have a greater sense of community and security, I will reelect you. And what it shows is that the social contract is actually what matters, even controlling for GDP growth and income. And I think that's a very important message that political leaders should be hearing.
Chris?
I think that's absolutely right. And I've got a question reading your book about wealth, because we've talked about those who are suffering. There are a certain number of people, more than 1%, who are doing extremely well. What is your view on the most effective way to tax wealth?
Yes. So if you look at what's happened to who's benefited over the last 20 to 30 years from globalization, it's clear that the top 1% have done incredibly well, and the poor in the developing world have done relatively well. It's the sort of middle class in the advanced economies who've seen the greatest stagnation in their well-being. And it's not surprising that they are the biggest supporters in many countries of populist leaders who are promising protectionism, xenophobia, and a whole variety of policies, which we know will not make them better off, but which reflect their frustration with the current setup. Now, how do you deal with that, and how do you tax wealth? all countries tax wealth in some way. They tax dividends. A very small number of countries have wealth taxes. And I think wealth taxes are challenging for tax authorities because the wealthy are very good at avoiding them, and they have very good accountants who have ways of finding ways to evade wealth taxes. I do think that inheritance taxes and dividend taxes are very effective ways to tax wealth. Many people have argued that in the wake of the pandemic, a one-off wealth tax, which would not give the wealthy a chance to reorganize their lives in order to evade it as well, would be a worthwhile thing to do. And there is actually quite widespread support and evidence that that could be an effective way of doing it. But sustaining wealth taxes is quite difficult from a fiscal point of view in terms of actually raising significant revenue. So I think inheritance tax and dividend taxes, capital gains taxes are more effective.
And in your view, in terms of the social contract, the new one, is that sense of fairness? I would argue it's more than just populism. Surely that's a crucial component, how we see companies as well as individuals pay their fair share.
Absolutely. And the current debate about global corporate taxation, I think, is a really good example.
Exactly.
Where people increasingly feel that corporates should pay tax in the communities in which they operate. And I think it's very encouraging that there's an emerging global consensus that is a fairer way to tax corporations. I think the other piece, and it's a big theme, I think, in my book, is that if we have to redistribute income, our system has failed. A much better solution is what economists call pre-distribution, providing people opportunities to make sure that their education system, the employability, and the way that resources are allocated gives people a fair shot at a decent wage and a decent life before the tax system has to operate. And so pre-distribution, early years education, a better system for training, and a better system for supporting people when they're unemployed. I think those are the places where we need to invest much more to make sure that people are capable of supporting themselves to have a good life.
Thank you, Nick.
You're the director of the London School of Economics and Political Science. Therefore, I need to ask you, can politicians handle this? Because you make a point of saying that underscoring the frustration with the social contract, particularly from the next generation. Obviously, the next generation has often been frustrated, but now the gaps are getting ever bigger. Do you have confidence that the political class can handle this, whether they're in authoritarian, dictatorial, even in the European Union, whether they can handle this, whether they understand the sensitivities, or they're in for a big shock?
So I do think we're at a critical juncture. And, I think of parallels in the Ebrd member states' history. Critical junctures can go many ways after the pandemic. I do think the pandemic will change politics. This is the question. Think of 1990, and when the Berlin Wall fell. Huge transformation in Central and Eastern Europe at that critical juncture. Think of the Arab Spring. Another critical juncture where actually, arguably, there was not that much structural transformation that resulted from that moment in history. And so it teaches us that the world can go different ways. What matters is who your leaders are, what ideas they have at the time, and what social movements are putting pressure on them. I think that troika of political leadership, ideas, and social pressures will determine what happens at this political juncture. And the outcomes may vary hugely by country.
But of course, in your nation of Egypt, there was a change after what happened, and it was an iron fist almost, with the field marshal who took over. And there's a very authoritarian system which has somehow controlled it. What about the democratic nations? Where there are real social pressures, there are real income pressures in many of the countries of the European Bank, which the European Bank operates in, where there are real pressures of suspicion that actually things are not going to get better. Even if they hear there's a green policy, they believe that's actually going to attack their jobs as opposed to create new jobs, which is the positive side of it. How does that get addressed in order to create a new social contract which gives confidence as opposed to raising worries, even deeper worries?
Well, I think leaders who are capable of explaining those trade-offs are clearly very important. And the nature of the political system matters. You know, one of the things you observe is that countries that have authoritarian regimes or even presidential systems deliver less generous social contracts. Countries that have proportional representation, where compromises have to be found between different groups, are better at delivering better social contracts. And so the nature of the political system will have a big impact, and the quality of leadership will have a big impact. Many reforms of the social contract came when you had this combination of huge social pressure, but also leaders who were able to explain the future to their population.
Do you believe, do you have confidence that leaders can adapt? I've been in many conversations where I've heard leaders say, I've got to think of the electoral cycle, and what I've got to do may not be the same as what I need to do.
Yes. Well, there is no doubt that the electoral cycle plays a huge role and shortens time horizons. And many of the reforms of the social contract to things, say, like pensions, take a very long-term perspective. In some cases, it's possible to extract some of these decisions out of the short-term political cycle. You know, why do we have independent central banks? Because we don't want governments, you know, using inflation and public spending as a way to win elections. And so that's one technique to depoliticize some of these decisions. I think the other thing we've seen is that when entitlements are embedded, it's very hard to reverse them. And so arguing for, let's just say, improvements in early years education, or the way or an educational allowance, which I argue for in the book, that every young person should get an entitlement for life, given that they'll need to be reskilling throughout their lives. Once those changes are made, it's very hard to reverse them. And that's another way that the political system can work for reform.
I've got a question here for Chris. Do you want to come in?
I think a very interesting question, I think, for both Minouche and also Ebru. You might like to comment as well. The question is from Layla Khan.
Yes.
Do we need a new world order in terms of some basic worldwide common policies based on the SDGs linked to the fundamental principles of human rights, and that all countries held to the principle of these? That would be, she says, a social contract globally agreed, and all nations are held to that. Would you both like to comment on that?
It's a big question. I mean, I guess a very important question. You know, I think one of the reasons I wrote this book was because I was increasingly came to the view that you couldn't get international cooperation unless people felt that globalization was benefiting them at home. And that the backlash that we've seen against multilateralism and international cooperation was because people felt it wasn't delivering for them. And the reason it wasn't delivering is not because globalization was bad, was because the social contract in their countries didn't share the benefits well. And so I actually think that in order to get that world in which you have international cooperation to deliver the sustainable development goals, you actually need better social contracts at the national level to lay the political preconditions for internationalism and multilateralism.
Ebru.
Yeah, I totally agree with Minouche. But certain things, in that sense, I think it is not that easy to achieve. It is totally the right action to take, but this is something that I would have doubt, because the nations are different from each other, their strengths, weaknesses, the way that they are heading to. That's why I do have doubt that will be easy to achieve.
Doubt that it'll be easy to achieve, but is it still achievable? What is needed? After all, we are all brought together by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. It's about the 8th time I've said that. But you can reconstruct as well the fabric of society, the expectations of society. And that's why I'm pushing you a little harder. Look at what's happened in Turkey. There's been extraordinary economic development in many ways. Many ways, and you have new geopolitical influence around much of the region and beyond.
Definitely, I think it is achievable, difficult but achievable. I think in that sense, the education will be very important, especially on the government side as well, to be able to achieve the right education to where the country is heading to put people on the same agenda will be the key. And I do have very much respect to what EBRD has achieved till now in Turkey, because I have to really mention it because it is really important for us. They have been very constructive and collaborative approach, and the know-how that they have brought to whole banking sector has been very valuable. EBRD, I really do appreciate what they have brought to Turkey. Certain things in nation-wise we won't be able to achieve, but with like the EBRD or similar institutions, certain things will be, let's say, easy to achieve. The valuable partnership, I do see in certain cases, maybe sometimes if we go by ourselves, we won't be able to convince certain institutions, but with the help of EBRD and also with the partnership with EBRD, I think things we might be able to take let's say, facilitate certain things in the eyes of the government. So for example, I can give an example, public-private partnership models that were applied in Turkey for the last 10 years. That model, with the contribution of EBRD, we were able to achieve. And in that sense, the social contract, in order to go together to government institutions, to other necessary institutions, I think we will be able to have a big impact together with EBRD.
We have a question on the social contract and the link to the climate emergency. It's only raised the question by Ali Saeed. We can say the social contract, he says, mobilized relatively quickly and effectively within short months when COVID-19 spread around the world. And now the question, why is it not as quick and effective global mobilization on climate issues? And what do we do about it, he asks. Minouche, would you like to start on that?
Well,
and then Ebru?
It is striking how, trillions were found by advanced economies to deal with the COVID crisis and mobilized incredibly quickly. And that was not the case for the climate crisis.
Can I say yet?
Yet. I'd like to think yet. I think it's interesting also because I think Ebru actually mentioned this, that many people are now experiencing the climate crisis in their daily lives when she mentioned what was happening in the seas around Turkey. And many people now are personally experiencing heat waves and experiencing land degradation. And so, it's terrible that we had to wait that long for people to actually physically experience it, but I do think that that's mobilizing political support. I think just one other thing I'd say, it's not just governments, it's also obviously business, and EBRD has a hugely important role to play, I think, in defining a new social contract with business, a new social contract that's about treating workers well, paying benefits, investing in green technology, investing in skills for the future. And in many ways, EBRD has the opportunity to be the exemplar of what globally responsible businesses look like in its member countries.
Do you think that multinational institutions now realize the duty upon them, the obligation upon them to think differently, to think almost more expansively? You've been a central banker, you've been in the World Bank, you know what it's like. And we heard from Kerry and Timmermans earlier, the US banks have raised $4 trillion so far, but it's nothing like what is needed. And an enormous amount is needed. There's almost not enough money in the world. Yet there's an expectation that somehow that money is going to be found to create stability within some kind of new social contract. I'm summarizing what you're saying. Right. But do you think that what's happening at the IMF, what's happening at the World Bank is moving in a direction of we can't allow this to happen again? We saw it happen in the COVID crisis. We can't let it happen on the climate emergency, or not?
Well, I think multilateral institutions are very responsive to their shareholders. And, let's face it, with COVID, we did not see a great deal of international cooperation in the response to the pandemic. It was essentially fought from national silos. climate is is hopefully an opportunity for us to do it differently. And I think many of the shareholders of the multilateral institutions know that this problem has to be solved through collective action. And COP26 is a huge opportunity, but I think with strong signals from shareholders, multilateral institutions are very capable of delivering.
But has COVID been a wake-up call to the national governments? They realize that even if it's cost them an amazing amount of money, technically, that actually there's much worse to come, and therefore they've got to be on the front foot. Were you heartened by the G7 communique? For example, it didn't produce the 100 billion, it produced hopes of 100 billion. But did it produce the right language, which gave you the impression of togetherness and moving forward to the G20 and other institutions as well?
I think the language was great, and the direction of travel was great. I would have liked to have seen more money on the table, both in terms of vaccines and also in terms of climate.
Did they bail out? Did they bottle out?
Well, I think the good thing is we've got several more bites at this cherry. We have the G20, we have COP26. I guess what I'd like to say is they made a down payment on the solution, but there should be more to come.
Asking a question based on an intriguing sentence in your book, Minouche. And you've worked a lot in government as well. You were head of a British ministry, the Development Ministry. One of the things you say here, I have learned after decades of conducting negotiations, is that sometimes making the problem bigger makes it easier to solve. Tell us more what you mean by that.
Well, it's interesting. So often in negotiations, people take the easy issues off the table first, and then they get really stuck on the difficult areas where they don't agree. And I have often found that if you leave a lot of issues on the table, there's real opportunities for trade-offs. So, you give me something on the carbon tax, and I'll give you something on international, sort of something on vaccine access, and I'll give you something on international trade and so on. So I do think that the opportunities that we have with international summits in the period ahead, there are some very big trades that can be done. And one hopes that we have creative negotiators who see the opportunities, say, to get developing countries to move more quickly to a green recovery, to a greener energy sector, for example, if there are serious investments put on the table through the multilateral development banks. There are some win-wins here, and keeping all the issues in play might help us find them more quickly.
Ebru, do you think you could adapt that principle to the business community?
Yeah, definitely. What I was just thinking, yes, there are things that the messages are very strong, the action promises are very strong, but there are certain limitations. And for that, we need the contribution like EBRDs, new technologies, innovation. Because, let's say in electricity generation, we can convert maybe most of the electricity generation to renewables. But what about the cement industry, steel industry? There are so many things. The action has to be very quick, and it has to be fixed immediately. But the pace on that side, I don't think that it is enough for us. That's why, as the financial, as a commercial bank operating in Turkey, unfortunately, our limits to contribute to that is very limited. But like EBRD, they do have a big supporter with big shareholders. And I think for the coming let's say 3 to 5 years, their contribution for these new technology for green recovery will be very important. If they will be able to facilitate that, to mobilize the other channels as well, it will be so beneficial for the world. This is how I see it.
Thanks, Ebru. We've got 5 minutes to run. We're going to overrun by about 5 minutes because Mark had problems connecting at the beginning. So let's just pick up with a couple of points here which you've sent in. This from Ano Jovanovic. In your opinion, what are the key steps for making better rather than a new normal after COVID-19 crisis? In other words, build back better. I've put that in because, Minouche, in your book, you say actually social contracts tend to be redefined at times of great upheaval. Is it going to take the upheaval of the last 15 months and potentially what's going to happen very quickly on the climate emergency, if you listen to John Kerry and Franz Timmermans, that this is going to be a driver, or is there going to be too much denial?
Yeah. So it's interesting to look at polling of people's attitudes pre and post pandemic. And what you find is that people are now more afraid after the pandemic. They are feeling more insecure, but they also value solidarity, equality, their health and well-being much more. And I think that will change politics. And I think people will ask for different things of their political leaders as a result of this crisis. And you know, there are some signs of that in some countries. I think it's still very early.
Politicians will realize what they've got to do and change quickly.
You know, I think it will vary by country. I actually think we're still in the crisis. I don't actually, you know, think that you will see the consequences for a couple of years. Think about the 2008 financial crisis. When we were in the crisis, things carried on. It was only 3 or 4 years later that you had the political backlash to the financial crisis. And I think we'll see the same with the pandemic.
Shall I just ask the last question, Chris?
Do.
Yeah. From Kamish Ir, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Do you think that incentivizing nations across the globe could bring about a change in the mindset? And that's really been underpinning much of what we've talked about in the last 75 minutes. When it comes to effectively managing the climate, I'm going to put in the word emergency here, not just climate change. This is now becoming a societal emergency, which in turn would positively impact economic growth. Because from President Biden downwards, everyone is saying that tackling the climate emergency is going to produce more jobs, better jobs. And you make a point in here about the nature of work changing significantly, very quickly.
I do agree with that. I chair lots of events at the London School of Economics, and I always get a question around, oh, but isn't the solution no growth? Isn't that how we're going to save the planet? Is that we have to stop all this economic activity and we all have to be, you know, eat very modestly and not have lots of stuff, basically. And I just think that's wrong. The transformation, the greening of our economies will require huge amounts of investment. We need to transform our energy and our transport systems. There are huge opportunities. If you look particularly in the emerging markets in the developing world, the investment requirements to transform and to meet the demand for energy and mobility that is in those societies is huge. And if we do that in a greener way, it will have massive consequences. But that's an investment and growth story. That is not a hair shirt, frugal, let's all, you know, go back to eating, you know, sort of, you know, chickpeas and salad story.
I'm enjoying dinner already.
The last word.
Yeah, let me give you a challenge to both of you, Ebru and Minouche. If we pushed you hard and said, what is the unthinkable you're not thinking about, but you think you should be thinking about? That for Minouche in a moment. But Ebru, is there something which you really are deeply concerned about, which should be on the agenda, should be on the risk registers of every corporate and every government about what is likely to happen? Because remember, a pandemic was on the risk registers, but no one really believed it would happen.
Yeah, I would say that the impact is unthinkable. That's why the impact, we won't be able to think about it. 2 years ago, we won't be able to think about COVID, and we don't know what kind of an impact we are going to have after the climate change. Now, that's why we need to be, it should be on top of everybody's agenda. We have to be brave to take actions, especially the financial system as well as the institutions. They should be putting targets which they think it's not easy to achieve. We have to push ourselves because it is for the sake of our world, it's for the sake of our children. And if we won't be able to achieve these, and we won't be having any world to live in, that's why I think it's time to take action immediately.
Minouche, final word. The unthinkable which you should be thinking about, maybe for another book, but certainly at the London School of Economics, where you're meant to be able to see over the horizon with a level of security that at least you can do it on Houghton Street.
Yes. So I guess my my unthinkable thought is this pandemic has been such a massive global trauma. It will change our politics and our societies. And I think good leaders will get out in front of that rather than be the victims of that upheaval. And getting out in front means having the ideas around what a new society might look like and what a greener economy would look like. And so I would say think fast about what the future needs to be look like and get ahead of it. Otherwise, you'll be swept away by it.
Minouche, thank you very much indeed. You know, when Chris and I wrote something like that a few years ago, people thought we were nuts. Look where we are now, and now we're talking about it. So, look, Ebru, thank you so much. I wish we were with you overlooking the Bosphorus in Istanbul. Thank you very much indeed. Maybe you can swing your camera and show us what we're missing. But thank you very much indeed. Thanks to Mark as well. Minouche, thank you as well. Lovely. She walked here from your office, didn't you? So we're delighted that you're here rather than talking to us down a bit of tube, a bit of glass. Thank you all very much indeed. And what we hope, Chris and I hope we've done is at least stimulated to think the unthinkable. And you should be filing that, feeding it back into wherever you work, whatever system you're in, to try and make people think in a more visionary way. Not what's coming down the track in 30 years, but maybe 30 days, 30 weeks, or 30 months, even though you're celebrating 30 years of the EBRD this week. So from Chris and from me, from Minouche and from Ebru, thank you very much indeed. And enjoy this week.